Tim, for bringing light to some important points to consider. I'd like to dive deeper and bring us back to your last 2 points about the operations and invisible indicators, specifically around how COVID has now given us a new opportunity to reflect on what we are designing, what we are building, and how sustainable it is to uphold. I especially enjoyed hearing your point about consequences from the things we make when we pull from the earth. A lot of what we do in design is to build these things and make mistakes, and afterwards go through the process of correcting it. And for example, the idea of recycling and taking waste and reusing it. When we look into the future, we can't really afford to reuse, to be a reuse culture, but to start thinking about designing systems like those who are designing vaccines for the COVID virus. Vaccines have never been designed for the COVID virus before, so they're starting from scratch. The root of it is that we really have to track and see things earlier in order to see results now. With that being said, almost in everything we build, we're going to have to involve designers. What would be the future role of a designer? Traditionally, we see designers as those drafting paper, literally sketching doodles, logos, fonts, all shapes and sizes, processes. Do we see a designer's new role in the post-COVID world being more backed by science, math, statistics on top of sketching? What is your take on post-COVID design thinking skills that one needs to have to learn in school, and what do designers need to evolve into in order to be relevant for the future?
I think that's such an incredibly great question, because it really is the question is, how are we educating the designers of the future? And in a way, the design that we have now is too much focused on the product. It's not focused on the process. So if you were to say the role of a designer going forward is to bring back the human in the process. Manufacturing, you mentioned manufacturing. Manufacturing has been so disconnected from the way in which people live their lives, and it shouldn't be. It should be like a living organism tied to how we're consuming. You look at the future is relocalizing manufacturing in many ways, micro factories, on-demand manufacturing. But on-demand manufacturing is manufacturing that is much more transparent, and average daily people have a role in understanding how it's impacting them. We don't look at the beginning enough. We think about the end. It's that problem in design where we say that we're gonna make things that people want and love, but we just scale something that is our best guess, and then we wonder why it doesn't work. And I would say like recycling is an example of that. It's sort of, and we're still kind of like selling this idea that we can take all the plastic and whatever and we can turn it into something else. I'm not against that on some ways, but realize when you're doing that, you're teaching people that those existing methods that aren't working are still viable, and they're not, and we need to change them. So it's a real fundamental change in education that needs to happen for designers. Another thing I would say is much more hybrid skills for a designer. The social sciences need to come in. Creativity is absolutely important. The importance for a designer is to say, what can a human being do that a machine can't do? So what is human learning versus machine learning is really what the designer needs to be focusing on. But are they actually doing that? That would be the challenge. And I think that we need to educate to that within our design schools and business schools. We need to be thinking in that way much more.
I really do agree with that point, because not post-COVID, because we're not out of COVID yet. But now that during COVID, I think we feel a lot of sense of loneliness in every aspect, right? So loneliness in the office, right? You can't really see your colleagues because you probably have staggered working hours, as well as loneliness with like social distancing, right? So when you're not seeing your friends as much, I feel like when you have the new the new type of design thinking or designers who do design thinking, who practice it, will have to really be good at the psychology of loneliness, right? And using that as the core purpose of why they design things, not just why people want it, but really how do you even design things that people want that would also rid loneliness as well,
Yes.
and regaining people, yeah, having design plans that regains people's trust, right? Like restaurants having an open kitchen, using digital menus, being transparent with how they handle food. And then with real estate, in Hong Kong, we have a lot of real estate, and we have a very dense population, and people live in buildings everywhere. And I wonder if real estate developers will have to involve a lot more open space and allow for enough social distancing between all of us in order to sell more apartments, right? So it helps with social life, and the healing of mental health if you can design something or some process that will help rid us of really the inner loneliness of what we're feeling now and perhaps in the future, right?
Yes, I mean, there's so much great information in what you just said, and it so touches on, the first step is that we have to understand we're dealing with unknowns. So we're designing to unknowns. There's a wonderful anecdote that I will share with you, talking to somebody who is in the finance world, who has not been in the office, and talking to him about, does he think that virtual work will be the future or not? And his main concern is that I'm very nervous about not being in the office because I can't show my boss what I'm doing and how hard I'm working. And when I look at that, as a designer looks at that problem and says, maybe there's something wrong in the way in which we're measuring your value in terms of your contribution to that company. That we have created structures that if you just change one thing, it sets off all these other kind of psychological factors that make us unhealthy. It shouldn't be loneliness right now. It should be a new connectivity. But the problem is that the way in which we were designing technology really fed loneliness. Loneliness didn't happen with the pandemic. We have, the minister of loneliness in the UK. Loneliness is an epidemic before COVID. So is COVID the virus that makes us aware of other diseases that were in there that we were feeding with our own design? The designer needs to see that. But a designer is also really good at reallocating resources. So I look at kind of cities, and you mentioned about cities. People talk about, I live in New York, and New York is my love. I love New York, and it is the center of the universe for me because it's such a creative story. But why does it work? It works because it didn't work because it was purposefully designed that way. It was rezoned for artists to use to transfer commercial real estate into artist living that gave us a 20, 30-year span that now sells multi-million-dollar apartments, the memory of that creative time in New York, right? So we have to feed what is people investing in creativity in ways that are far less obvious. It's more ambiguous. I mean, the creative revolution in the 70s and 80s in New York City wasn't clear. It wasn't it wasn't, but you need policy to allow it to happen. So when you're talking about Hong Kong, it's reallocation of that. I mean, Hong Kong has suffered from, people, micro apartments, designing, squeezing, trying to get more and more into smaller spaces. Now suddenly you have real estate that's open. You need a different way of thinking in terms of how to use that. It's not to simply go to something, it's trying to find the people who know what to do with that, right? That isn't a business question. First, it's a creative question, and then it becomes a business question. And it's also a policy question because you need policies that are actually going to enable it. So there's a lot of opportunity in change, I would say.
I think the government has a lot to really reflect on in order to drive this kind of thinking, right? In your presentation, I also enjoyed learning about the point you made in self-operations, how companies or factories suddenly are perhaps faced with with demand changes. If a factory was making jeans and suddenly had to adapt to making virus-related products, how adaptable are they and how sustainable had they been running? If they had to suddenly stop operations, if demand of their original product slowed, are they able to adjust quick enough, right? So Tim, could you tell us a bit more about what you see in terms of US companies thinking more long-term and how they build things, make things, and if there are any examples of implementing more sustainable approaches?
Well, in some ways, again, I mean, that's the crux. It's that what we have over the last 50 years is a change in process. It's, we got the assembly line and it was most understood by automobiles, right? So automobiles have really sort of defined how culturally society has worked. But that was a manufacturing process. And we kind of got disconnected from the fact that, I mean, Ford Motor Company is a car company. They're not really a car company, they're a manufacturing company. And so with crisis, we're moving from an industrial era into sort of the post-industrial era. It's much more on ideas on what should be made and how it should be made. So every company, you're not a fashion company, you're not an auto company, you're actually a material production company. So the question is how agile are you in terms of changing that, being able to produce in small, in large, in changing different kinds of material technology opportunities. We get to, if we stay with one method and it's not working, we hit a wall, right? And so the point is to be able to create more adaptable systems. I think in some ways it changes how manufacturing is going to work, that it needs to be more network manufacturing, less large scale, idea of building one thing and building a lot of it. It's a lot of building smaller on demand. If you look at, I think about the fashion industry, I think of companies like Amazon making investments in this area, is that if I know what people will want, and I know, like, you get people more involved in the pattern of a dress than the actual finished product of a dress. Like, you don't buy the finished product that you have too much of. You get them to understand how to buy the pattern of that and be involved in that, and then be able to manufacture it exactly to them locally and deliver it to them, right? So that's a change in idea of thinking. So all companies are in the manufacturing and logistics business. The best companies right now are the ones that understand that and know how to sort of tie together those fundamental core innovation pillars with understanding how culture is changing. Because you can't just sort of build things really well. You also have to know, well, what do people want? And how do they change how the change in what they want is working. People are not predictable. One of the things that will happen with the pandemic, it happens with recessions, is that people say, well, people have less money and so they buy less, and then, then they'll start buying it again later. No, they'll buy differently. And the question for all companies, are you paying attention? Are you gaining intelligence during this time to not only change what it is that you make, but how you make it? So the how of that is like, the finished product is as much about the process of that product. And so you should be making investments in the core aspects of your manufacturing process, the sourcing of your product, of your materials. All of those things become much more important right now.
Speaking about these core pillars, I think the purpose of the design of a company and the sustainability strategy of a company is also really important, right? So Tim, could you share with us some of your thoughts on this in the context of designing of companies, design of spending and retail, even designing of a person's future career in terms of, bringing it back to the title of this today's talk about ghost trends. these things existed pre-COVID, and that we were unaware of. But now with the onset of crisis, those trends have accelerated and revealed itself as something more obvious points to consider. So could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that, on the topic of sustainability, it's not that companies weren't thinking about sustainability, but they thought they had much more time. I look at I look at a company like H&M, which has a sustainability position and so forth, but a lot of what they actually do, how the consumer interfaces in what the concept of sustainability is marketing. We have to move. The reality is that we need to stop marketing as much and start innovating. Innovation needs to be the core of how we think of goods and services working, a better understanding of people. And so in terms of thinking of going in and working within companies and sort of affecting change, you have to say, those are the kinds of skills that are going to be much more impactful. It's being able to think long term, but know how to make an investment short term that you can connect to that long term. The other part that I would say is very important is realizing how interconnected businesses are with things that aren't directly related to them. So like every business is related to the future of cities and the livability of cities. So, but are they really aware of that, or are they working against their own interests by creating what is a future crisis in congestion, cities not functioning in certain ways? So like understanding the interconnectedness of things is going to be very, very important.
Thank you. I know the audience has a few questions for you. So we're going to go to the live Q&A, Tim. So we have a question from Peter Lee. Hi, Tim. Thanks for sharing. Are there any hidden trends exposed by the pandemic that you are surprised to see or find fascinating?
As a trend forecaster, you're kind of like, you're never surprised. You sort of learn never to be surprised. But one of the things I will say is that I have a lot of, it's great to see that I have a lot of faith in the resiliency of people. And you see the fact that, one of the things about design, and this gets to the core of design, is that design isn't something that is made. It is something that is, it begins to be designed when people start interacting with it. And when you look at like what's happened with the pandemic, is you look at how people hacked their own apartments to be able to, one of the things that I noticed was how people used their balconies during the pandemic to be able to like connect with other people. They hadn't used those balconies in that way. It's like people adapt and change. Those kinds of ways, it's like it gives you hope, and you realize the humanity comes out during this time. But the question is, are we paying attention to it? It sort of works well as a story in a news article, and then we kind of move on and we go back to the things that we were doing before. But those are really important signals for us to think about how we continue to make fundamental changes to how we make things, how companies function, because it's watching people and how they adapt to a crisis like this.
We have another question from Leah. How can the general public build up their resilience to combat invisible situations?
Research. Do your research. Care about what is less obvious. I use this a lot, is that, as researchers, as designers, we need to think much more like epidemiologists. And it's one of the sort of positive aspects of having to, work through a virus like this is that I think everybody's become a little bit of an epidemiologist. We hear about epidemiology every day in the news. Epidemiologists care about looking at smaller signals and smaller patterns that are happening and recognize how important they are. And that if you pay attention to those things, but then know how to make investments, work and have a company culture that you can say, that's something that we can begin to invest in. And you can start building a market that will be the post-COVID market, which there will be. And those that are much more forward thinking will be much more ahead, as opposed to the ones that are kind of treading water and hoping things go back to the way they were. They won't. So thinking creatively is going to be very important, and paying attention to the signals that are emerging. People's behavior is beginning to change. It changes. That's why, I mean, I talk about language a lot. Look at that language. That language is the indicator. It's telling us, before you could ask somebody what they say the next year will be, they're telling you in the way in which they use words to describe things that are important to them. And that's going to be the framework for your brands that you have, for the next 2 to 5 years.
We have time for one last question from Fred. He'd like to know, what are your thoughts on home, since it plays a huge part in many people's lives? Everyone's stuck at home, connecting with others virtually. How do you see the trends of this little space of our own? How do you think it would evolve coming out of the pandemic?
Home, what a brilliant question, because it's the thing that is going to change the most. It's what we think we understand because we live in them, but they're under so much transformation. The fact of the matter is we're stuck in our homes, but we're connecting out of our homes. So you think of things like telework, telehealth, all of these things, our living rooms, our bathrooms, our bedrooms are becoming health spaces. They're becoming connected to our doctors and into our self-management of our health. The question is, and technology is certainly there to help in doing that. The question is how to make that truly healthy. It's not simply that the technology can track things and then everything is okay. We can create a problem there if we're not careful. But the thing is that be aware of how we can make our homes much more healthy. Tying our kitchens to our health. I think the trend in kitchens is amazing, because I see there's a couple of trends. Kitchens, we see what we eat as being so much more tied to our management of our own health. I see our bedrooms, we see our sleep tied so much more to the management of our health and our brain health. We're going to live longer. We're living into our 80s and 90s. And if we live into our 80s and 90s, we need healthy brains. We have healthy brains if we sleep well. So how well are we managing that? Those are the kinds of issues in terms of how we design our homes. We used to design them to look a certain way. Now we have to have them function in a certain way, but to the benefit of the people who live in them. That's going to be very important.
It has been such a pleasure having you, Tim, tune in live from New York, and our audience in Asia for staying up. I hope that we were able to get through as many questions as we could have. From all of us at KODW 2020, thank you for tuning in. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you all.